Hello, in this tutorial I'll teach you how can you print a variable value inside of a text. This is when we are creating a SQL query in iBatish or a page inside of HTML, we may want to print some values that comes up from some variables that we have set before. So in this tutorial I'll teach you how can you do that, how can you print values inside of texts. So let's log in our framework, choosing the advanced workspace and show the advanced items. So I was telling you that I will teach you in this tutorial to print variable values inside of SQL queries and when you are creating pages. So let's start by the SQL query. So if we go to the data access tab, let's just open a default query that we already have here that we can see some examples. So let's just open here. Let's say it could be this one here. So basically in this UI I can see a syntax which contains a hash symbol, then a name, which I suppose is a variable name, and another hash symbol. So every time that you see a syntax like this, hash symbol, variable name, hash symbol, it means that every time that the system will call this query here, the system will find this syntax here and will know that exists this variable inside of the input that we pass when we call this query. This means that every time that we call this query, we'll pass an input and that the input will have an attribute called action IDs that will then be replaced. That value from that input will then the system will replace this syntax by that value. So basically we can see the file where we can see more examples in here, where we can see in the first SQL query where basically we have here 3 codes that will be replaced by the system. So this means that every time that I call this query, I'll pass it an input, and that input will contain, probably be an array that will contain the name attribute, the created date attribute, and the modified date attribute with the corresponding values. And then the system will replace this syntax here with that values. So this is how you can call SQL queries using these types of hash variable name hash codes. So basically every time that you are creating a SQL query and that you want to pass some values that will come from the inputs, you do exactly like this. So you put the names of the attributes of that inputs surrounded by the hash symbols. So in summary, every time that you call a query, you pass an input. That input that will be probably an array that will contain attributes inside of that array. And then the system will get that correspondent values, will match the attribute name with the name that is inside of these hash symbols, and then will replace all this syntax here by the correspondent value that are coming from the input. If by any chance the input that you pass is not an array and is directly a string or a numeric field, automatically the system will replace all of the hash code, so all of the names surrounded by the hash symbols, it will replace this syntax by that correspondent value, by that correspondent input. So basically that's how you create SQL queries, passing dynamic values. So this is related with the SQL queries. Besides this, we can use this same syntax when we are creating pages. So when we are creating a page, let's see just an example here. If we open the indexed page, we can open the main settings and the resource tabs. In here we can create resources. So let's say that I create a resource. Let's do this, a very simple resource which this will be a string, where in here I'll put a name, Maria, and I'll create a variable or a resource called name. So let's say that now I want to create a second action where I want to print this name here, the value of this variable. So let's say that I am in this task here and in some part of these fields I can create my own SQL here in this task, but let's suppose that in some of these fields I want to print that specific value that I put in this variable. So what I needed to do in here, I could go through the UI and just say the variable name, or I could just type this code directly, hash symbol name hash symbol, where name is the variable name that I give it here, name. So basically this means that I could in here, let's say that I call a list of records from the database. Let's say that in here let's call like a list of schools, and in here I name it schools. So this means that when I'm drawing, let's erase this, so when I'm drawing the HTML, I add a container, in here I add a table, and what I am doing is now I go in here and I say input variable name. In here it's the schools, which was the name that I gave, and then the schools has how many attributes each record of the schools has, as an ID, well in this case is a school ID, and the attribute name. And automatically I can see that the system creates me here these hash codes here, based in that. Basically what the system will do, it will loop these variable schools that I'm putting here, schools, which was this variable that is now here, which the list of records, the list of schools, and then for each individual record I'm printing the school ID here, and in here I'm printing the name. So every time that you see ID X, it means that you will replace this code here by the corresponding index of the loop of when he's creating the table. This same syntax, it could be used instead like this, without the dollar symbol. This works too. Additionally, I don't need to put this here. I could do something like this. Schools in here, and in here schools. So basically this is exactly the same thing. So based in these syntaxes here, then the system will read this syntax, hash symbols the variables names inside, and then hash symbol, and then we'll replace the correspondent syntax by the correspondent value of the variable, the correspondent variable. So this means that I have an array here with multiple arrays inside, where each sub array or inner array has a school ID attribute and a name attribute with the correspondent values. Now let's say that, let's just erase this example and let's go back to the previous example where we had here a name, and in here we had just a simple string value called Maria. Now let's say that I want to print this resource, this variable name here, name, in some piece of HTML that will be in my editor here. I suppose, yeah, I could be doing something like this, but because this is a resource, if I want to print the name, I need to always to do to write the syntax with resource before. This is specific for the page editing. I need to write the resource key before, and then inside of brackets I can put the name of the variable. Or if I wanted to, instead of resource, I could just write SLA, which means sequential logical activities, which are these here. So the actions that I add here are sequential logical activities, SLAs. In here, let's say that in here, instead of name, I have something like or let's say, let's go back to the previous example, where in here I was getting the schools lists, and I was putting that the result into a schools. So in this case, if I wanted to print a specific element of the school, let's say the first school and the name of the first school, I could do something like this. Or like this. So automatically this will print the specific value, it will replace this string here, this syntax, by the correspondent value that are inside of this variable. So basically I show you how to create this syntax, this hash symbol, variable name hash symbol, inside of the SQL queries and inside of the resources tab, which are the SLAs, the sequential logical activities, where you can create multiple sequential actions, multiple sequential activities, and then to print the resources that you create in here, in this tab, in the main settings of the page, and how to print that resources inside of a HTML in a page when we are editing a page. Additionally, this syntax here, this SLA, can be used in the form modules too. So when I am creating a module, so if I drag and drop a module here, the form module in here, basically this will give me sequential activities too, where I can create my own logic here. So in here I could do exactly the same thing. School, let's just put here schools, and then in here I have the design HTML, where in here I add a container, add a table, and in the table I put the variable schools, where it creates this syntax here, and then the school will have a school ID, attributes, and a name attributes, and okay. So basically in here it's very similar with what I was doing in the page, in the main settings of the page too, where I'm creating my sequential activities, where I create my schools variable with the list of records, and then I'm printing the list of records in here with this specific syntax. Again, this is the same, then this. You don't need the dollar symbol, it's exactly the same thing. And that's it. So in summary, I teach how to use this type of syntax here, where the system, every time that it finds this syntax, hash symbol, some name, hash symbol, it will try to see if in the input that the system received to execute a SQL query, or to execute a page, or to execute this module, the form module, it will see if inside of that input, if it exists any key, any attributes correspondent with the name that we put here in the middle. If we have brackets inside, he'll understand that we'll try find first the first name, and then it will go to the second name. So it knows that exists in the input here. So the input here is not, it will be this, the value inside of the schools, which is an array, a numeric array. So it knows that will replace this by a numeric array by the correspondent loop. So this is a table, so it will be a loop for all the fields inside of here. And then to know for each of that record, it will be an attribute, the key corresponding to this name here, which will be school_id, and which will have a specific value, and which will then replace that specific value. In our documentation we have some examples which explain this in detail. That's it. So thank you very much.